So here's how I want to inspire you. I claim that reality turned a corner, an important corner in the United States, for people who want to cut the military budget when Congress passed the Budget Control Act. And it's also my perception that many people in America who sympathize with us and want to cut the military budget, if you look at polls, and when they ask people, you know, what do you think should happen to the federal budget, that would tend to indicate that we have a lot of friends, right? You know, the majority of Americans, you ask them, well, what do you think about cutting Social Security? Like this. And what do you think about raising taxes on the rich? Yay! What do you think about cutting the military budget? Yay! So that's public opinion, according to polls. But the question is translating that public opinion into action in Washington. Because if you took a poll of lobbyists, you know, you would get a different. If you took a poll of lobbyists, you would get a different result. So that's the dynamic that we face: public opinion against the lobbyists, and how to make public opinion win this debate. As long as I can remember, it's been a holy grail of progressives in the United States to try and cut the military budget. You know, we have all these friends. But America doesn't realize that reality just turned this corner with the passage of the Budget Control Act. And if you look around, as I do, I assume many of you do, Huffington Post, Common Dreams, Truth Out, you know, what are left liberals saying about politics in America right now? There aren't a lot of people talking about cutting the military budget. And there isn't a big buzz around this right now, which is really kind of shocking when you think that for any group of people like us, and you know, like me, as I look around this room and the conversations last night, you know, a lot of us have been at this for a while. And John was talking yesterday about working on you know, the opposition to Reagan's war in Central America in the 1980s, which many of us were involved in. So, you know, all of our adults, there's a group of people, a lot of people around the United States. So all of our adult life, the thing that we have always wanted to do is to cut the military budget. I remember as a college student, just starting to get involved, there was a poster, which I'm sure many of you have seen some version of, where there's this beautiful picture of children playing on a playground in a schoolyard, and the caption is, "It will be a great day when our schools have all the money we need, and the Air Force has to hold a bake sale and buy a bomber." And this poster, I think, really encapsulates a lot, you know, how a lot of us view the question of the federal budget. So for as long as we remember, always, you know, it's this holy grail we've been seeking for. And now reality has turned a corner where Congress is talking about significant cuts to the military budget, or to projected military spending over the next 10 years. And so you might think that all these people around the United States, the whole odds that are looking forward to the possibility of significant cuts in the military budget, that there would be this reaction. But we're not seeing it. And the clock is ticking, because by Thanksgiving, the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction, the Super Committee, is supposed to come up with a proposal for $1.2 trillion in reduced government spending over 10 years. And the question of the day is, how much of that $1.2 trillion is going to come out of the projected military budget? And hundreds of dollars of cuts in, hundreds of billions of dollars of cuts in projected military spending are on the table. So you would think people like us would be like, holy cow, pour on Washington, demand that Washington, demand now, and all our lives have been saying, cut the military budget, cut the military. But right now, there's a real possibility that hasn't existed before. If you look since World War II, there's been a few times when, you know, at the end of Vietnam, there was a drawdown. At the end of the Cold War, there was a drawdown in military spending. Since 2000, the military spending has been going up and up and up. Now we have the possibility for a drawdown in military spending. You'd think there would be, a Tea Party-like clamor for cuts in military spending. But we're not really seeing that. The only clamor that you're really seeing in the press is a clamor on the other side, the clamor of the defense contractors, of the military contractors, going to Washington Hill this week with their second to none campaign. And that's the voice that's being heard. Or that's the voice that's being reported. And so this should, be setting us, this situation should be setting us on fire. It's certainly true that Citizens United was a horrible thing. It's certainly true that corporate power is a horrible thing, and corporations have all this money to spend on campaigns and what amount to bribes for members of Congress. But there's another side of the story, which is that much of what these military contractors are doing is simply First Amendment political activity of talking to Congress. And our people aren't mobilized, at least not as much as we could be and we should be. So this is the context which I want to talk about, the topic of the impact of military spending on our economy. I want to talk about it in this particular way, the super committee. The super committee, $1.2 trillion over 10 years in reduced government spending, an opportunity for hundreds of billions of dollars of that to come from projected military spending. In fact, $1 trillion in reduced military spending over 10 years is on the table. If you look at the way that the first round of the debt agreement is being characterized, it's being characterized as $350 billion in reduced from the projection, reduced military spending from the projection over 10 years. And the administration claimed, and the press is reporting, that the administration and Congress have already agreed to reduce military spending by $350 billion over 10 years from what was originally projected. Now, there are questions that's not like, we don't have that in stone. There's no guarantee even that $350 billion will be cut in military projected from the growth path that was previously agreed. That's the baseline for this discussion. From that, $350 billion. No guarantee that will happen. Future Congress can do whatever it wants. But that has become a baseline in the debate, that assumption that we've already agreed this, so that even Republican members of Congress who oppose further cuts in projected military spending are using this as a baseline and saying, okay, $350 billion, but no more. We won't tolerate any more than $350 billion. On the other hand, you know that under the Budget Control Act, if this super committee doesn't come up with $1.2 trillion in reduced government debt over 10 years, or if the proposal that they come up with is not approved by Congress by December, then that will trigger $1.2 trillion in automatic cuts over 10 years. And under the Budget Control Act, half of that $1.2 trillion has to come from the military. So we have a scenario under the Budget Control Act, a scenario where the super committee doesn't reach a deal, or Congress doesn't approve the deal, where the military budget will be cut by $1 trillion from the previously projected spending over 10 years. And that would take us back to what, at an annual level, 10 years from now, annual military spending would be what it was in 2007. So this is not, this is what that Obama slogan said, these people that want to abolish the Pentagon. This is not abolishing the Pentagon we're talking about. But it would be significant, a cut from the previous growth path. It would be a real cut. It would be actually reducing the level, something like 15% over the period. And it would be of the order, it would be like, if you look historically, the drawdowns after Vietnam, it would be like this. It would be a real drawdown in military spending. And it will have real consequences, and it would be meaningful in terms of impact on the domestic economy. So this is a possibility. Hundreds of billions of dollars, even $1 trillion. And of course, if you ask me what is just, what should we aspire to, that's another story. But it's important for Americans to know, it's important for all of us to know, that this is on the table of debate in Washington right now. $1 trillion in cuts in projected military spending over 10 years is on the, in the same way that public option in healthcare was on the table in discussion and in debate. $1 trillion in cuts in projected military spending over 10 years is on the table for debate. Okay, so I said, now I'm going to tell you, I've made this argument and there are many more arguments are made to say why this is realistic, this is practical, this is pragmatic, this could happen in the next few months. This is a winnable fight in the next few months. $1 trillion in cuts, projected military spending over 10 years. Now I want to tell you why that would be meaningful for the majority of Americans. Why would that be a meaningful victory for the majority of Americans in terms of the impact of military spending on the economy? In 2007 and 2009, originally in 2007, economists from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst did a study of the impact of military spending on the economy, the comparative impact of military spending on the economy. Remember that this is at the time when the economy was imploding because of the financial crisis, and people were starting to talk about stimulus and how we're going to stimulate the economy. So it made sense to say, well, okay, if there's going to be a stimulus package, how should that money be spent? And the conclusion of that study, that's sort of the top line conclusion of that study, was that among the ways that stimulus money might be spent, military spending is the least efficient, has the least impact, the least bang for the buck among ways that the government could spend money, including not only construction and healthcare and education and mass transit, but even tax cuts for personal consumption create more jobs than military spending. So ideally, we progressives, we would like a new Works Progress Administration. We want to bring jobs, these are the things that we want. But even tax cuts to stimulate personal consumption, like is the main plank of the jobs bill that President Obama has just announced, is extending the payroll tax holiday. So that's tax cuts for personal consumption. That creates more jobs than military spending. And this is an absolutely essential key point for people to understand. Of course it's the case that military spending supports employment. Of course it's the case that if you say, we're going to build this fighter plane, and we're going to contract with Boeing, and then some workers in Seattle will have jobs. But every form of government spending creates jobs and supports jobs, and military spending is the least efficient. It's the least efficient. It's the least bang for the buck. Okay, this is incredibly important now, newly, in the context of the Budget Control Act, because military keynesianism has a logic, and that was alluded to in the last presentation. While it's true that military spending is the least efficient in creating jobs, it still might make sense if you were under a political constraint or somebody beat you up and handcuffed you and said you're not allowed to do anything else, then it might make sense. And in a sense, that has been true historically in the United States because of the politics, because of the distribution of power. It was as if somebody passed a law and said, you're not allowed to do these other things, you're not allowed to talk about these other things. So in that context, it makes sense to use military spending to stimulate the economy, if you're not allowed to do anything else. So when people talk about what happened in the 1930s in the United States, you know, we certainly see a lot of analogies today, including the fact that at the beginning, Roosevelt's team came on strong with stimulus. Then there was this blowback about, oh my God, government debt. And then they, you know, 1936, 37, they pulled back. And then there was another recession as a result of pulling back on the stimulus. And then there was a spike in production as a result of not the U.S. going into the war, but the U.S. starting to participate economically in the war by arming Western Europe. So that story of how, you know, World War II pulled the U.S. Out of the Depression, it has some truth. And the truth is that the politics of the United States were an obstruction to the you know, demands of rich and powerful people against government spending, were an obstruction to the stimulus that was needed, and the demands of supporting the war in Europe allowed getting around that political obstruction, like the Keynes quote. You know, he said, well, you know, if we can't do it the right way, then the war would happen. But now we are in a different position because of the government, the Budget Control Act. Because now, by agreeing, the President and Congress, that there is a goal of $1.2 trillion in cuts over 10 years, some of which may come from the military. Now everything has been put on the same table. Every form of government spending over the next 10 years, with partial exception of the wars, we'll come to that, has been put on the table. But particularly the base Pentagon budget is right in it's right in the middle of the table right now. Every dollar that isn't cut from military spending in the plan that the Supercommittee presents to Congress, every dollar that is not cut from the military is a dollar that's going to come from somewhere else. Probably domestic cuts, maybe cuts in Social Security, maybe cuts in Medicare spending. So now it's one for one. We're not in the situation where you can do military spending, deficit spending, and that's the only thing you can do. We're in a situation where everything's been put on the same table, and it's one for one. Military dollar protects the domestic. If you can cut a military dollar, that protects the domestic dollar. If you fail to cut the military dollar, that exposes the domestic military dollar. So now the fact that that military spending is the least efficient way of creating jobs, that's critical. Because in the study, in the University of Massachusetts Amherst study, $1 billion put into the military budget that created 8,000 jobs. And $1 billion put into domestic spending in the least efficient of those alternatives, tax cuts for personal consumption, that created 10,000 jobs. So that means that if you move $1 billion from the domestic budget to the military budget, you destroy 2,000 jobs. If you move $1 billion from the military budget to the domestic budget, you save 2,000 jobs. So that means that if you move $200 billion, you save 400,000 jobs. If, for example, we could end the war in Iraq this year, like we agreed, if we pull all our troops out of Iraq this year, like we agreed, by December. If we had 0 U.S. troops in Afghanistan after 2014, like has been announced, the plan of foreign combat troops supposed to leave Afghanistan in 2014. If we did that, instead of what the Pentagon wants to do, which is have 10,000 U.S. troops in Iraq indefinitely, and have 25,000 more troops in Afghanistan indefinitely, You compare those two worlds, a cautious, conservative, certainty beyond underestimate of that cost, $200 billion. What we can save by ending the wars just when we agreed, not today, not tomorrow, but when we already said. End the wars when we already said, save $200 billion against what the Pentagon wants to do. Moving, and if we don't do that and the money comes out of domestic instead, 400,000 jobs destroyed. Okay, so what's 400,000 jobs? Well, the U.S. labor force is 150 million people. So if you could put an additional 400,000 Americans to work today, that would reduce the measured unemployment rate from what it is today, 9.1% to 8.8%. So that's that's not solving the unemployment problem, but that's a significant move. The jobs bill that the president just announced, it was private economists estimated that if the whole package was approved by Congress, it would reduce the unemployment rate by a percentage point. Right? So it's of the order of magnitude, we're talking about the order of magnitude of the proposals being made in the jobs. And that's just the $200 billion. What if we could take $1 trillion or $1.2 trillion? We got $1 trillion cut out of the base Pentagon budget over 10 years, and then we got $200 billion out of the war budget over 10 years. Then you have 6 times the impact, right? So that would be analogous to reducing the measured unemployment rate by 1.8 percentage points. The unemployment would be 7.3% instead of 9%. These are real impacts. This is a real impact that we could have in the United States in this battle that's happening between now and Thanksgiving. Real impacts that we could have that would help put Americans back to work. So, I've just been given my 0 time left. So let me just conclude, and then I think there's going to be a time for questions. So we face, I think, a kind of emergency, those of us that want to cut the military budget, because we have this historic opportunity, and America doesn't know it. Right? People who are the constituency of this opportunity don't know it. The other side is they know exactly what's at stake. Their, stocks of military contractors have fallen on the expectation of military cuts. They are out in force. Our people are not out in force. We need to mobilize our people right now across the United States to hammer Congress like the Tea Party, make their phones ring off the hook, and every time they show their face in public, cut the military budget now, make the super committee, cut the military budget, and end the wars as part of the deal to reduce the U.S. debt. Thank you.
That feels so great to hear. That is a fantastic, winnable, short-term. I'm thrilled, having been one of those people when I was young who was talking about cutting the military spending. So I think the popular chore this morning of trying to catch up our time. And I know that we're going to have an exercise with Lisa that's going to start soon, but not until after we get some questions for Robert. Even though I came late, I did do my reconnaissance and found out that y'all have had the brilliance of Dave for a good 45 minutes. So we're going to get some questions for Robert. You might not get all that you want, so find Dave and Robert at the break and at lunch if you don't get your question answered. But I bet we can get at least 3 to 5, maybe 6 folks if they have questions for Robert. You either want to make your way to the mic or I'll restate what you said.
You mentioned in the University of Amherst study that the least efficient way they found to create jobs was through military spending, and that the least efficient way through domestic spending was by giving the personal sort of loans.
Well, other people correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it was spending on. Oh, so the question is, military spending was the least efficient way to create jobs. Of the other ways, domestic spending, tax cuts for personal consumption was least efficient. What was the most efficient? I actually don't remember. The other things were mass transit. So it was mass transit. The thing that they were trying, one of the things they wanted to get at this study was green jobs, and they said, well, we don't really have a good way to measure this, so we're going to do mass transit instead, it's kind of a proxy for green jobs.
Thank you.
And we've got, I can take a stab. So, oh, you've got a question for the mic? Okay. So let's see. I've got a woman back here. You're number 1. Number 2. Anyone else? Number 3. Number 4. Number 5. Number 6. That's all we can take. It's a stack of 6. I know you know your numbers. Please make your question brief, like, what's the most efficient way to create jobs? Nice brief question. Number 1.
Well, I got here late, but I'd like to know what you think about the possibility of focusing on all the military bases we have around the world, the fact that we still have soldiers after World War II in Europe, that we're not really planning to leave, that we're going to hunker down in the big embassies in Iraq, and how is that going to impact our current situation of Iraq and Afghanistan? Because let's face it, the military has plans for the next and the next and the next, because that's how they maintain their jobs.
Yes, I totally agree. Everything. I mean, at the end of the day, what's going to happen is that the super committee is going to pick a number, and the Pentagon is going to say to the Pentagon, this is what you have to cut, and the Pentagon is largely going to determine how they're going to do that. But in the meantime, it's wonderful to, and people should do this, to speak about everything, including getting to zero in Iraq and Afghanistan, no military bases in Iraq and Afghanistan, including cutting U.S. forces and bases in Europe, including cutting U.S. forces and bases in Asia, like the hated military base in Okinawa, like the Jeju base that Handwright mentioned last night. It's all good. It's a great time to talk about everything that the Pentagon is doing that we don't want them to do is a way of cutting military.
Number 2. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know that $1 trillion is indicated in terms of what year they have to spend and how much per year, or don't they talk about that?
Right. So the $1 trillion, so the whole framework of this debate that's happening is cutting the projected U.S. government debt over 10 years. People are looking at the baseline created by the Congressional Budget Office, to sort of continue our current path. What's the U.S. government debt expected to be in 2021? And how can we reduce that number by $1.2 trillion? So that's what the cut is. And in speaking about the military, it's about cutting the projected military spending by $1 trillion over 10 years. And with the baseline being like a 2% annual growth in military spending. So, again, at the end of the day, the super committee and the administration will come up with the framework, and the Pentagon will figure out how to come from that. But it will be over 10 years. It won't be all at once.
No, but will they start the first year?
Absolutely. In fact, the process has already started with the appropriations that are happening right now. The Senate Appropriations Committee this week just voted to freeze the Pentagon budget, which if you might think, freeze, no cut, but if you could do that for 10 years, that's a 20% cut. You can freeze the budget.
Number 3.
Even though military spending is less efficient, the reality is the factories are there, the jobs are there, the workers are there. How feasible is it to make this shift and cut their budget and be able to keep people working right away? I mean, it's just easier to say, well, our job is there. How are we going to get a job 3 months down the road or whatever?
Right. So again, these are cuts that are going to take place over 10 years, cuts in projected spending.
Bring us to 2007.
To bring us to 2000, exactly.
Not so
Bring us to
radical.
2000, not so radical. It's not everything shutting down right away. And the overall determinant, the overall story is the overall level of unemployment, which is now 9.1%. If you allow unemployment to remain at 9.1%, of course the real unemployment rate is higher, then you can't do anything. Then people, grab whatever. We need full employment. We need the unemployment, which is, less than 4%. We had that during the Clinton administration. So when that's the case, then you have jobs available for people that lose their other jobs. If you don't have that, then it's a disaster. But if you have 9.1%, it's a disaster anyway. Young men coming home from young men and women coming home from the wars, they don't have jobs. Why? The overwhelming reason why is because we have 9.1% measured unemployment. So that's what we need to fix, and that's why we need to move the money. Because putting the money in the military is creating more unemployment.
And the unemployment rate is certainly in the double digits. Number 4.
Could you repeat your website?
Yeah, it's www.justforeignpolicy.org.
Ooh, that was my favorite question. Number 5.
You say we should make our voices heard. How do we compete when the Pentagon owns every talking head on TV, including the Huffington Post, and how do we compete with that? It's like trying to listen to a 2-year-old sing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star at an Ozzy Osbourne concert.
Did y'all hear that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's totally true that between lobbyists and the bought media, how do we make our voices heard?
I'm glad you asked that.
Robert is the
Well, because my feeling is really the opposite, and I tried to say this in my remarks. The Pentagon doesn't control everything, and I worry that this analysis that many people on our side put out, saying that the corporations run everything, the Pentagon runs everything, it sounds radical, right? It's like, yeah, wow, radical, burn the system down. But I'm afraid that it demobilizes our troops to tell them that you're just saying there's nothing we can do. Because the enemy owns everything, and there's nothing we can do. And in fact, if you look in history, it's not true. Our side's won a lot of victories because we fought. And even recently, when the banker bailout was put forward during the Bush administration, I mean, the Pentagon's powerful, Wall Street is powerful. This, the bankers. I mean, Durbin said about the Senate, the banks own this place. And when they brought that to the floor of the House, it was voted down. Even though Wall Street was united in demanding we must have this bailout, it was voted down. Why? Because the phones were ringing off the hook of people saying, don't do this bailout. Now, they turned it around, Bart, and it came back and said, you're going to vote on this again. So eventually they won. But that's not, and this is an extreme case of this bailout that Wall Street wanted. So the point is, that, we're not going to win automatically. We just try and fight. And obviously we're fighting on a rigged terrain where the other side has more money and more power. But it doesn't mean that we can't win. And the Pentagon doesn't control the Huffington Post. I write on the Huffington Post. Other people write on the Huffington Post. I think our problems are elsewhere, or at least our immediate problems. What the story that I just told you about the Budget Control Act and how this is actually, if you want to cut the military budget, the Budget Control Act is the greatest thing since sliced bread. The commentary that's dominating left liberal discourse in the United States is that the Budget Control Act was a total disaster, sellout, capitulation by Obama to the Republicans. And this narrative, largely shaped by the commentary of Paul Krugman at the New York Times, and he had a point. He had a point that I agree with. The point that Krugman and others made that I agree with is now is not the time we should be talking about the deficit with 9.1% unemployment. Now is not the time. We should be talking about the jobs deficit. So there, Krugman's right. But if you're a person that wants to cut the military budget, which you know is a lot of us, then you love the Budget Control Act. You don't love that the debate is about the deficit and not about unemployment. But you love the fact that the Pentagon is now in the crosshairs, and we have an opportunity to win significant cuts in military spending.
Thanks for bringing us some optimism.
Right, yeah. Yes, sir.
So I think we need to rethink our side. You know, who is the we here? How can we send out a message over this next few months, build coalition? What kind of talking points as far as, you know, instead of demonizing the opposition of the Tea Party, I mean, as far as like you're saying that the least efficient is putting, these tax cuts to put money back in people's pockets. But on the inefficient military spending side and on the domestic spending side, instead of emphasizing stuff that's going to alienate conservatives, what kind of common ground can we reharvest those primary campaign signs and professionally print and put out all amongst the presidential campaign signs to get the message out, to put the work. Yeah.
I'm going to start answering that, and we'll let Robert finish and close up. So the reason I'm going to start answering that is because I imagine that on the website there are lots of resources for mobilizing folks in the short term between now and Thanksgiving to get the win on this particular piece. And over the course of the weekend, you will get resources from other of us who are presenting around how you build a movement to win the big picture and take down the military-industrial complex. So in 30 seconds or less, if you'll wrap up. And Lisa, get ready to come to our presentation.
That's a great question. I'm totally pursuing a policy of non-cooperation with any demonization of the Tea Party right now. The Tea Party is helping us. The Tea Party helped get us the Budget Control Act. A lot of people in the Tea Party are totally okay with slashing the military budget and are saying so publicly. So the Tea Party is not my enemy right now. Absolutely, we have Republicans in Congress, even, of course, we have ones that are really our friends on a lot of stuff. But even like kind of the mainstream Republicans see, you have a lot of people who would rather cut the military budget than raise taxes. And so, tactically right now, they could be on our side in this coming debate. I do not want to raise taxes, even on rich people, to protect the Pentagon budget. I would rather have no tax increases and slash military spending.
Right.